Welcome to another episode of Athens and Jerusalem. Let's begin where we can't escape. Let's begin with Logos.
Now, I would say that this openness, this being in the world, this referring to the world, to objects in the world, what I would like to call self-transcendence, this is disappearing as soon as you project a human being into a lower dimension than its own dimension.
Point of the V goes up to the nuclear explosion that created it.
Tell me this, Dr. Oppenheimer. Do you ever become frightened at what you're finding out here in this area that can't be measured in either time or space?
You see, that's a real point.
Do not be afraid. Open your hearts, open up your hearts.
Open up your hearts to Athens and Jerusalem. The infants of our culture, united, independent, polarized, and even bloody. Athens, the cradle of wisdom and rationality. Jerusalem, the cradle of faith and spirituality. In this podcast, we look at reunion. Could reason be more than modern secular skepticism? And could spirituality be more than belief? So, welcome to another episode of Athens and Jerusalem. And this time we like to have a focus on one particular person in history. And this person is Ibn Rushd, as I call him. I'm not very familiar with the name, but Ibn Rushd. And Stephen, you would like to say some words about him before we discuss his ideas.
I can certainly give it a shot. Not being an expert in Islamic philosophy, and with the realization that if one goes to Wikipedia or the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, within a few minutes you'll get probably more and more accurate information than I could sort of deliver off the top of my head. But in a way, Ibn Rushd is a perfect exemplar of the kind of person we're interested in this podcast, because he represents a very clear attempt to unite Athens and Jerusalem. He was an Islamic philosopher living in the 12th century. His life spanned most of the 12th century. He lived in Spain, the Iberian Peninsula. He was a philosopher's philosopher. He was a very rational thinker, although at the same time a committed Muslim. He was also very much of a philosophical temperament, and he was one of the key figures responsible for taking Aristotle, which had been translated from the Greek into the Arabic, and trying to harmonize Aristotle with the religion of Islam and with a religious viewpoint more generally. It should be mentioned that Ibn Rushd is seen as kind of the end of a line of rationalizing philosophers within the Islamic tradition, of several figures that could be briefly named. Al-Kindi is traditionally listed as the first. He lived in the 9th century, and Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina are all great figures in the Islamic philosophical tradition. And it's very interesting, that whole tradition and how it came to be, with this discovery by the Arabs and by this new religion of Islam, of this tremendous intellectual legacy that they came into contact with in the early years of Islam, in the first couple of centuries of Islam, because of the military expansion of the religion across the region. They came into cultural contact with the Byzantine Empire and with Christianity and with the heritage of the Greek philosophers, which was still extant within the Eastern Roman Empire, which Islam gradually ate up over the course of the centuries. And the Muslims sort of discovered Greek philosophy then, and a tremendous program of the translation of so much of Greek philosophy, Greek medicine, Greek science into Arabic took place in the first few centuries of Islam, which is it's a whole interesting story on its own. And that helped to seed Islamic thought and spark a kind of renaissance within Islam of people taking the fruits of Greek rational thought and applying it within this new cultural and religious context of Islam. And Ibn Rushd is seen as kind of almost the last great figure in this philosophical school that kind of ended with him. He certainly wasn't the last, but he's the last great figure. And but the end of his story is kind of the beginning of the story of the Christian encounter with re-encounter of the West with Aristotle and with the Greeks, because Ibn Rushd was part of also not only an influential movement within Islam, but many of these Islamic philosophers and their works then got translated into Latin and then entered into the West. And so then there was a kind of Renaissance. I mean, Renaissance isn't the right word because that was more the 1400s, but there was an early sort of re-encounter with these ideas of the Greeks that was interesting because it started in Greek and then it kind of funneled through the Arabic and then back into the Latin. And so a lot of people were reintroduced to Aristotle through things like the writings of Ibn Rushd, yes. who wrote so eloquently about Aristotle, and so much of Ibn Rushd's work was actually analyzing Aristotle, producing voluminous commentaries on Aristotle, and then taking the thought of Aristotle even further in the ways that he could. And much of that then got incorporated back into European thought. People like Thomas Aquinas were influenced by Ibn Rushd. There was a kind of answer to back and forth, but not so much of a pushback. It's more like Christianity and medieval Christian thought was very much saw Ibn Rushd as an ally in a way in this process of bringing the sort of the rational thinking of the Greeks into the Christian context.
Yes.
So I don't know if that's enough of an introduction to him.
I think that was a very good summarize of his action, and I wonder if we could ask the question: would the Renaissance in the 14th century would it happened without Ibn Rushd and the Islamic tradition of keeping the Greek philosophy alive?
A very interesting question. I'm sure the historians have strong opinions about that, and I don't know if I'm allowed to have an opinion on that as a non-historian, but or at least an educated opinion. But it certainly seems to me that this heritage of Islamic thought coming into European thought around 1100s was perhaps a necessary precursor to the full-fledged Renaissance, which happened a century or two after that. I don't think it's a highly controversial statement to say that the European Renaissance really could not have happened without the earlier intellectual Renaissance that happened within Islam. There's just so much that got transmitted through these Islamic thinkers into Europe.
This whole thing that went on in Andalusia, as you pointed out, Stephen, in Spain, where Jewish, Christian, and Muslim thinkers were sort of cross-fertilizing one another, so to say, and they were listening to each other and getting inspiration from each other and building on each other, and they all had I guess Aristotle as their sort of shared focal point. I think that's so beautiful because I mean, in today's world where we often see these religious groups as being in some sort of a collision with each other, it is good to be reminded that it hasn't always been like that. It doesn't need to be like that, and that essentially there's enough commonality to be able to build something meaningful together philosophically.
Yeah. I think I also believe that his method, his way of doing hermeneutics, was something that was brought into the European way of writing, and like Thomas Aquinas, you mentioned. I think he uses in many ways the same way of argumentation and thinking, and the method is one thing is that he did summarizing the ideas of Aristotle, but then he also went through whole books of Aristotle, and he tried to comment on each part of the books, and then he also brought it further with his own ideas based on the words of Aristotle. So he had like a 3-step method. He first summarizing, then commenting on each word, and then trying to bring in another perspectives.
I would just like to very briefly return to something that Stephen pointed out, that because at least one figure with whom Ibn Rushd was very much in sort of contradiction with was this, I believe, Egyptian Muslim scholar Al-Ghazali, so Ibn Rushd was maintaining the fact, in contradiction to this other gentleman, that that philosophy was a legitimate and even a necessary approach to understanding the Quran or religion in general, whereas Al-Ghazali was of the opinion that philosophy was an insufficient or a wrong sort of approach to religion. I think that this bringing together of Athens and Jerusalem in the thinking of Ibn Rushd is an important precedence that we can learn and be inspired by.
Yes, Al-Ghazali wrote a famous treatise called Tahafut al-Falasifa, or the incoherence of the philosophers, how that's been translated. And Ibn Rushd replied with his own treatise called Tahafut al-Tahafut, or the incoherence of the incoherence, which is a direct refutation of Al-Ghazali. But the question is, how many people read Ibn Rushd's refutation of Al-Ghazali? He was over there on the sort of the extreme western edge of the Islamic world, of the Islamicate world, and one can legitimately ask the extent to which Ibn Rushd was even read within the Islamic world. There's no question of his influence in the European world, and so much of his writings passed into Europe via the Latin. But being the sort of end of this philosophical tradition in Islam, how many people were reading him versus reading the Mu'tazilite theologians, as represented by Al-Ghazali and others, or were reading more the different efflorescence and manifestation of the philosophical spirit which arose in Persia around the time of Ibn Rushd, and which had its efflorescence a little bit later. And I'm referring to people like Suhrawardi and Mullah Sadra, who represent a kind of a different take on bringing in the philosophy of the ancient Greeks into an Islamic context, whereas Al-Ghazali was much more rationalist in a traditional sense that, let's say, Europeans would be very familiar with through Thomas Aquinas. The different sort of take that you see in Suhrawardi and Mullah Sadra, which arguably had an even bigger impact, was more Platonizing than Aristotelian, and would have been more influenced by Plotinus and Plato, and then it would have been by Aristotle. And so it adds a degree of complexity and interest to this whole topic, because when we talk about Athens and Jerusalem and what's the real sort of conflict that Ibn Rushd represents for us, it's not so much a conflict between, say, religion and philosophy, but it's a conflict between Islamic religion and a particular school of philosophy, namely Aristotelian philosophy, which has a very different kind of flavor and a very different set of starting assumptions than Platonic philosophy. And
just to clear that, because it's, of course, it's easier to put Platonic philosophy into a religious way of thinking than an Aristotelian. So when they was focusing on Aristotle, it became more difficult. And if you have read Umberto Eco's book In the Name of the Rose, then you will see how afraid the religious people was towards Aristotelic books, and especially So of course this is one of the important discussion also in the Athenian perspective. What kind of rationality should we focus on?
Yes, and that's also, I think, what makes, even though you might think of Ibn Rushd as being, okay, this guy lived almost 1,000 years ago, and this is just merely of historical interest, I think that the whole question of Ibn Rushd's life and work and reception within Islam is a current issue. I mean, it's still a living issue, because what Ibn Rushd tried to do in uniting these sort of different ways of thinking, and arguably ultimately failing at doing so, is the same sort of questions that we're asking today. Is there a way to bring together these two great threads of Western thought, of the rational versus the faith-based? And we have examples, historical examples of people who have tried and, let's say, failed in the past. Can we learn from their attempt? Can we learn from the failure of that attempt? Does the attempt and the failure of that attempt translate coherently into the present day context, at least where we are in the West, where the primary parties are no longer Aristotelianism and Islam, but we're talking more about a kind of Christian civilization and materialistic philosophy. Do the two map onto the issue with Athens and Jerusalem as we experience it today? And to the extent that they do map onto each other, what can we learn from that?
Exactly, and I don't know, to the extent that I'm not familiar with the sort of the argumentation between Al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd, and the way that it relates to exactly said our current sort of thinking around these issues, is whether you see rational and philosophical thinking as a way to better understand matters that are of metaphysical nature, or let's say pertain to religion, or whether you see it as almost like an insult to religion to say that you can do so, that supposedly the realm of religion and metaphysics is such that it cannot even be approached in this way. Or maybe another way is, there's this talk about the God of holes, like that, where the divine exists, where science fails, or rationality fails, or philosophy fails. And of course, this is leaving currently less and less room for God. He's being sort of squeezed out of the picture as these approaches develop. And of course, then Ibn Rushd's approach seems to be, no, I mean, it's not that, that's not the case. It's not by finding where rationality does not sort of have access, but it's through rationality and philosophy that we can actually better understand and appreciate those wonders and mysteries that are of supernatural, so to say, nature.
And this is where I feel a little bit conflicted, because Ibn Rushd experienced a bit of persecution in his day. His ideas were seen as heretical by Orthodox Muslims. And I want to root for the guy. I read about his life. I want to root for him. I feel like I'm on his side in the sense of I want to see a sort of harmony achieved between these two schools of thought, which seem to be at war with each other. But at the same time, I wonder whether what Ibn Rushd was trying to do, what his project was actually achievable in the way that he thought it was. And what I mean by that is Ibn Rushd really believed that these metaphysical questions could be resolved through logic. And Al-Ghazali felt that they couldn't. They're resolved through, to simplify it, through revelation. The truth has been sent down. It's in the pages of the Quran and in the Hadith, and that is our source of knowledge. That is our source of knowledge about the world. For example, is the world eternal or not? Are human souls separate, or is there only one soul that that we're all that we all partake of? These sorts of questions, Ibn Rushd felt you can have rational answers to these questions, and people like Al-Ghazali felt that reason is not your principal guide in these matters. Are we on the side of those who believe that actually, these two should come together? Is that sort of the right way forward for us today? Or is the right way forward instead to acknowledge that these matters of metaphysics, the nature of the soul, the nature of God, God in his essence versus God in his actions, all of these sorts of philosophical questions that occupied so much of the time of these Muslim philosophers, perhaps all of these topics they're not scientific topics. They're above the divided line, that Plato talks about in Plato's philosophy. Above this divided line are all the metaphysical questions, and below it is the world that we can observe, that we can measure, that we can test. Below that divided line is the world of science. It's the world that we can actually apply these rational methods to and come up with a pretty definitive answer as we iterate over time. Whereas above the divided line, these questions of theology or theological philosophy that so much of Ibn Rushd's time was devoted to, perhaps there is no rational way to a certain answer. Maybe in a way Ibn Rushd was just as wrong as Al-Ghazali was, that there is no correct answer to the question of whether, from a philosophical point of view, as opposed to a scientific point of view, as to say whether the universe had a beginning or not.
I think Ibn Rushd had I like this way of thinking, or his answer on this question you are raising, and if I understand him correct, he says that over the divine line, or above the divine line, you have to use allegoric or metaphoric way of explaining something.
Mm-hmm.
And below you could use more logical or empirical. I'm not sure what he will call that, but the important thing is that you have if you are trying to express something above the divine line, you have to use metaphorical, allegorical way of speaking, and that's also why if a book is divine, then you can't understand it literally. You have to understand it allegorically. If not, it wouldn't be a divine book. We often think that we understand Plato as the one with all the allegorical and metaphorical way of thinking, and Aristotle, he's more down to earth. But of course, if you read the metaphysic of Aristotle, you will see that he has also a metaphorical and a divine way of thinking also. They are not contradicting each other. And like one thing they are similar on is this idea that there is a connection between wisdom and divinity. And this is one of the big questions raising also by Ibn Rushd is, could there be a divine, something divine that is not, how to say it, omniscient, to know everything, to have wisdom? Could divinity be without wisdom? And I think that's a very interesting question to raise.
Before we go there, may I just also suggest that that while was, as you said, Aristotle had the more metaphysical perspectives, I think that even if you take the cave analogy, the famous cave analogy of Plato's, and one could say that even if one lived in a cave and were aware of the fact that what one sees are just shadows of a higher reality, yet those shadows represent something. And although they're not sort of, how to say, one-to-one true, but they're more like maybe a map of that, that's the same way as a map gives us an idea of the terrain without actually giving us any real picture of or image of the hills and the flowers or the trees or whatever, that that divine scripture, although it is impossible, in fact, to bring things, if there are things that are of some higher order, it is impossible to make us aware of them or to be able to fully understand them in this state of development or in this world. But it is possible to somehow sort of translate them and map them to the realities of this world. And I think this is maybe what you were also, Knut, referring to in terms of analogies and symbolism. And I think this is I think this is an important sort of connection point between Athens and Jerusalem also to bear in mind.
And I think also that Aristotle would be I would agree with you, Cameron, that what is in our world is in many ways also something that is part of the divine. It's not like only shadows or because reality is part of what exists and what has been brought into existence. Or no, that's a wrong way of explaining it, because what has always exist, but the quality of what exists necessarily in the Aristotelian way of thinking, you need some kind of divinity to give quality to existence. So there's a difference between existence that has always been, just as existence, and the quality, the form, a formed existence that needs a divinity. That's the argument of Ibn Rushd and Aristotle, the way I have understood it. And
so and so Aristotle would be on the side of those who just take the world as is, whereas Plato would be on the side of those who take the world as being an image of something more real. Is that a good way to kind of boil it down? Idealism versus realism.
Yeah, I would say that, but also you could discuss how great is the cave metaphor. Does it fit? And it fits Plato's way of speaking in some way, but I'm not sure that it actually fits him in all way. But that is often been the understanding of his philosophy. Yes. To be honest, my thinking is that the cave is mostly about how difficult it is for human to still live in a world where people don't understand your way of understanding the truth. because they are living in what we would call like cultural truth. They're stuck into the culture and not able to see the universal truths. So, and this is the main reason why he explained the metaphor, is how difficult it is to be Socrates in the Athenian society when everybody believes that you are just stupid when you talk about this universal truth. Yeah,
there's no question that the cave analogy is incredibly powerful. I'll sort of put a stake in the ground to give it even more reality than simply a way of differentiating those who have a bit more wisdom from those who have less wisdom. And coming in from a background in science, particularly in theoretical physics, there's a strong intuition from the fact that we understand the world so well by recourse to a very small, relatively small set of mathematical laws, which the world seems to follow with uncanny precision, that these mathematical laws of the universe seem to be in that category of Platonic forms that Plato could only have dreamed about 2,500 years ago. I mean, the fact that you could write down these purely abstract constructions of the mind, with a few symbols, and these few symbols are able to allow you to extrapolate into the physical world to like 11 or 12 significant digits. I mean, it's an unfathomable degree of accuracy in the case of quantum field theory, that one is left as a scientist looking at this unreasonable effectiveness of our mathematical theories of the world. One is left with a suspicion that the world is kind of Platonic in its structure, that there is a kind of undergirding simplicity that underlies the complexity of everything that we observe. And that simplicity is Plato couldn't have talked about it in these terms, so he used the metaphor of the cave. But it just strikes me as being a plausible thing.
And he does speak about it in Timaeus, and the way he expressed these different geometrical figures that we are able to understand as harmonic. It's amazing. It just is. But of course, he connects them with reality on a very special way, and also with our soul and our way of being. So in a very interesting way, a very special way. But of course, like if we talk about the Aristotelian physics, then the picture is a little bit different, because we don't believe in the Aristotelian physics today. And this is also a very interesting question that we often, when we discuss something about some historical facts, we often present them like, okay, but this was like an old idea and they are wrong today, or this idea is correct. But I think it's important to differ between how it is originated, how it is made, and if it's still valid. And my point is that because Thomas Kuhn wrote about this, and he said like, yeah, okay, but he was in another world, in another paradigm, so he had his ideas and we have ours. But what I think is that if Aristotle or somebody else in the Greek society actually had thrown a stone and done some simple experiment, they would have realized pretty quickly that his idea was wrong in his time. So in my ideas, it is okay. They have really hit something special in some occasion, and in other occasion they were wrong. And I guess if you look at how much Aristotle actually wrote, of course he couldn't have really great knowledge about everything, but he tried, and he tried maybe a little bit too much in my perspective.
One wonders what kept the Greeks, for all their incredible brilliance, it was almost this miraculous efflorescence of thought in such a short period of time with such a fairly small population of people and limited geographically. What kept them from the full discovery of the scientific method, not just of theorizing about things, but of measuring them and then hypothesizing based on those measurements and then testing those hypotheses and iterating? And even the Muslims, for all of their brilliance and for the brilliance of people like Ibn Rushd and this whole galaxy of enlightened individuals for those centuries that the Islamic civilization flourished, they didn't discover it either. Why did it take until the European Renaissance, particularly the scientific revolution, to hit upon this idea of actually measuring and testing your ideas against the world in a way that produces objectively verifiable theories that then can become a kind of collective heritage of a civilization and allows us to accumulate knowledge and to keep building in the kind of stair-step fashion upon the knowledge that came before? What was it? What was that special thing that allowed that to happen only a few centuries ago, and only in the context of the European Renaissance and scientific revolution? Even though, I mean, and we want to give all credit to those who came before and what they were able to achieve. I mean, the Greeks didn't strike upon the scientific method as we know it, but they, aside from the philosophy, they were able to create amazing instruments that we only know of through a few brief references in books and things like the Antikythera mechanism that were dredged from the bottom of the Aegean Sea a century ago, and that turned out to be a kind of mechanical computation device of amazing complexity that was able to predict the motions of the planets and the coming of eclipses and all sorts of other things. They managed to do this without the modern scientific method and without actual theories that we might think would be, if not necessary, certainly very helpful to the construction of devices such as this. So we absolutely have to give credit to earlier civilizations that that might not have struck upon the sort of the scientific method in its full power, but we're still able to produce amazing wonders in the physical world.
Cameron, do you have any thoughts on the question?
Yeah, I mean, to me, to go back to some of the sort of fundamentals of this conversation about Ibn Rushd and Athens and Jerusalem, I think, to me, a very important and fascinating question is that of human rationality in general. And I think one aspect of it is that is human rationality something universal? In other words, and this is in a way I would like to also connect this to Jürgen Habermas' theory of communication. I mean, if we were to actually leave aside all sort of how do I say, selfish motives and so forth, would we be connected by universal rationality that would it make it possible for us to find truth not only in matters that are easily measurable in terms of physics or something like that, but in those issues that are now very important and maybe sort of matters of even human survival? I mean, would we be able, for instance, as followers of different religions or different worldviews, would we be able to use our rationality as a means of finding a common view and being able to concur on what is right and true?
Huge question. Is reason, maybe reason is necessary, but is it sufficient? Maybe it's a necessary precondition for a kind of future goal that we would like to see civilization attain, which is, let's say, a higher degree of cooperation, a higher degree of coherence on a global level, which does seem incidentally necessary for the near-term survival of our species. We're going to have to figure out how to work together more closely than we have in the past. Is reason or a rational approach a sufficient, let's accept that it's necessary, but is it sufficient? And if it's not sufficient, what else do we need? Well, I guess that's the whole theme of Athens and Jerusalem. The Athens piece, we may agree, we need a world view that is at least grounded in reason, but is that sufficient? And if it's not, then how do we come to agreement around the Jerusalem piece? Given that it's above the Plato's divided line, that's in the realm of metaphysics, that's in the realm of forms, that's in the realm of narrative, it's in the realm of metaphor and parable and other things which aren't necessarily rational. They come to a leap, they tell a story, they ignite something in the mind or in the spirit that could not have been ignited by a rational sequence of steps. That's the kind of magic, I think, that exists in that realm, in the realm of Jerusalem, in the realm of faith, in the realm of which all the religious traditions have had some spark of that. Is that necessary going into the future to motivate people, to orient people in ways in relation to others, in relation to their own lives, both individually and collectively, in ways that mere reason can't? Of course, I'm asking this as a question, but I think the answer is yes. But it does beg a whole series of further questions as well. How do we achieve any kind of consensus around that?
Exactly. I think that's because I think the reason why there is such a strong anti-religious sentiment, especially, for instance, in the countries that Knut Ove and I come from, in Norway and Sweden, is because it is perceived as that religions or revealed word has caused more conflict in its interpretation than it has caused elevation and inspiration. And so I think the question that you pose, and that this could be maybe something that we pursue in the next step, is that what do we need to go into the future, and does rationality help us, and how?
Yeah, if I should try to say in my words, I would say that there has been a fight against religion and truth or wisdom in the Western society, and this fight has been like a heavy fight where religion, the best fighter in many years, many decades, but then the truth in some way managed to, and the fight, I think, is still going on in some way. And I think also that if we divide this idea about wisdom and divinity, then we still, the fight will go on. But if we understand divinity and the metaphysic as something above the limit of what rationality and science could be able to do, then we could keep them more alive, both of them, as real discussions with real questions. Maybe. I'm not sure if I agree with myself on that one, but anyway, to Stephen, one of the question about this, about rationality and sufficiency, is also that what would happen if rationality was sufficient, if we actually came to a place in our historical movement where we actually lived with one common rationality, what would happen?
I wonder if in this century or in this past century, the 20th century, we have experimented sufficiently with that idea to have determined that it's not the way forward. In other words, have we experimented sufficiently with political philosophies, ways of being, which are attempt to be purely rational, which attempt to take God and faith and religion entirely out of the equation? Communism, for example, other systems of thought which are try to take that out. You say, okay, this has been a cause of issues in the past. Religion obviously is a cause of intense conflict between people. There seems to be no way of reconciling one religion from the other. Hey, science works. Why don't we try to base a culture on science alone? And I just mentioned communism, but you have Comte and others. In Europe, you have all sorts of examples of people trying to set up systems which are like purely rational. Have we had enough sort of experimentation with those to determine whether that's enough? Given the full parameters of the human being, which include a psychological component, which one can't simply dismiss. And maybe that psychological component is such that we can't do without narrative, story, a larger sense of purpose, which, while we want that and need that to be consistent with the raw, brute facts of the universe as we understand them, nevertheless, we understand that these narratives are going to reach beyond and tell stories and give not information, but give inspiration, which is not purely of a rational nature.
Yeah. So we have to distinguish between some kind of, if we understand wisdom and truth it becomes fundamental if we believe that we actually have got it, and the continuing search for the truth or wisdom. And I think that's a very important distinction to keep in mind in our life.
Well, yeah,
one comment on Steve, on Cameron about this common intellect or universal rationality or something. I read a Norwegian philosopher wrote a book this year, and he argued for a common rationality. And his simple argumentation is that whoever we are, 2 adding 2 becomes 4 for every human being, wherever. And pi, that's something that every human are able to grasp. And that's, for him, and he has some more examples in logic and in. The 3 of us are able to talk together in this way is because we do understand the way we argument. And I believe that every human being are able to understand the argument and the way of rationality. And that's also why I think that if there had been just a continuing clash between religion and truth, the truth would, in one way or another, it will win, because you can't fight truth. It's not. It's just something that exists. It's not something you can say yes or no to. That's my opinion.
Yeah. I guess the question is how we can sort of ease our ways into that truth. And yes, I think that there's a lot of empirical evidence that human minds work very similarly, and our rationality is universal. I guess the problem that arises when people of different ideologies differ strongly is not so much perhaps the rational process, but the axiology on which that process is built. And of course, that is then an issue in itself, that how can we agree on a common axiology for our rationality?
Meaning the axioms we begin with?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, because I think that the reason we sometimes even rational or people with a rational capacity do not concur is because they have so widely different axioms that it is. But then I also would like to say something about this thing about psychology and emotions, because it's very interesting. You know, I myself am a Middle Easterner who has grown up in the West, and somehow I think Western thinking has elevated emotions, maybe because culturally they're sort of underrepresented in the West. Whereas if you read many, I come myself from Persia, so if you read many Persian poets and philosophers, they, on the contrary, are trying to say that we should sort of keep our emotions under control, because that's a culture where emotions sort of overabound. So I wonder whether our emotions and psychology could not arguably be something, as it were, sub-rational, and if we were to become more rational, we could have them under control and make better decisions. But that then there's something which is supra-rational, which is not irrational, but supra-rational. And I think that is the real Jerusalem, that it sort of evokes our rationality and our rational understanding, but it also evokes our rational amazement and that, you know, sense of mystery that great thinkers like Einstein experience when they use their rationality to the extreme. I mean, to their limits. So I would just like to want to make a distinction between sort of fulfilling our lower needs of, you know, some sort of balance or satisfaction or something, and our higher capacity, which is more than rational, rather than being of less quality than rational.
I think that was a nice ending in the introduction of our podcast. Viktor Frankl says something about this, and it's about this different dimension in human, and we often just end up in the lowest dimension of. And it's interesting because we create then like a hierarchy in human, and yeah, in my opinion, I believe there are some hierarchy inside me, but that's also something we might discuss.
Okay, great.
So, thank you for listening to our podcast this time, and looking forward to have a new podcast. So bye-bye.
You have been listening to Athens and Jerusalem, created by Cameron Namdar, Stephen Phelps, and Knut Ove Essay. Nora Juel is the broadcast voice and technical support. Music is pieces of Edvard Grieg's Morning Mood. The voices in the intro are Viktor Frankl, interview with Robert Oppenheimer, and Pope John Paul II. Thank you for listening, and please check out another episode.